Welcome to the Ticktective podcast and video series, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, where our mission is to make Lyme disease easy to diagnose and simple to cure. I'm your host, Leah Gertner, Director of Education and Outreach. Lyme disease is the most common vector-borne disease in the USA and is a global issue. This show includes interviews with the researchers we fund, as well as other interesting people in the Lyme scientific community. We are a nonprofit foundation based in Silicon Valley. Thanks to a generous grant that covers all of our overhead, 100% of all donations go directly to support research and prevention programs. You can find out more or donate at bayarealyme.org. Thank you, Chris Kresser, for joining me on the Ticktective video and podcast series.
Thanks for having me, Leah. It's a pleasure.
Chris Kresser is a renowned expert, leading clinician, and top educator in the fields of functional medicine and ancestral health. He is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Paleo Cure, as well as the book, Unconventional Medicine. Chris is the co-founder and educational director of the California Center for Functional Medicine and the founder of the Kresser Institute. Chris regularly shares his evidence-based insights from trusted sources and world-renowned health practitioners and coaches through his blogs, webcasts, interviews, and his own podcast, Revolution Health Radio. So Chris, during your decade-long struggle with chronic illness, you learned firsthand where healthcare mattered most and where it came up short. After seeking the help of more than 30 healthcare practitioners and ultimately having to learn and implement behavior changes on your own with limited support, you emerged with your health and a vision and drive for changing and improving the practice and education of functional medicine. Can you please tell us about your health journey?
Yeah, I'll be brief because it was long and arduous. But I took off to travel around the world for a couple of years in my early 20s, and I was doing a lot of surfing. I was in a little village on Sumbawa, which is an island in Indonesia, and a bunch of the people there who were surfing at that break got exposed to a waterborne pathogen, actually several pathogens. So there was a stagnant pool of water near the river mouth there, and locals dug a trench to drain that pool and into the river mouth. And so all of that water where cows had been defecating went out into the surf break, which are often located right at river mouths. And unbeknownst to a lot of us who were there surfing, we were exposed to it. And I would say 70 or 80% of the people there got quite sick. So I took some antibiotics that I had in my medical kit, and the acute phase of it passed relatively quickly. But as I continued to travel, after that, I went to the Maldives and was there for a few months, and I was in South Africa and then Reunion Island, Mauritius, and Madagascar. And after about 6-7 months, I started feeling really sick, and it became clear to me that it wasn't something that was just temporary, that was going to go away. So I made my way back to Australia, and that was where I started to seek medical care. And then when I didn't make much progress, I decided to go back home to the US. And although most of the doctors and other practitioners I saw were, meant very well and did their best to help me, it was pretty clear that the medical system was not set up to deal with those kinds of problems. I think conventional medicine's phenomenal if you break your leg or get in a car accident. But it's not very good at dealing with complex chronic illnesses. And so I just kind of struggled for the first few years trying to even get an idea of what I was dealing with and how to approach it. And then once I did figure out that it was multiple parasite infections and as well as amoebic dysentery that I had, there was the effort of treating those infections and then dealing with the after effects of the treatment of those infections. And that went on for a long time. And during the course of that, I experimented with a lot of different dietary approaches. From being macrobiotic vegan to eating raw food to eventually stumbling upon what we would now call a paleo diet. But at that time, that was not a term that was in in use really, except for a small handful of people that I didn't know or wasn't exposed to. And that was what worked best for me. And then was also doing a whole bunch of other stuff throughout that whole period to try to restore my energy levels and rebuild resilience and find my way through. And as I did that, at the time that this all happened, I had no intention of becoming a healthcare practitioner. It wasn't, I wasn't the kid who, when you asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I said doctor. That wasn't on my list. And but over time, as I started to recover, and as I got deeper into my own research into all of the things that did help me recover, people started to ask me questions. And I, at some point, realized that even though that wasn't necessarily the career choice that I would have made, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, that it was in some way choosing me, and that I felt like I could translate or transmute some of my own experiences in a way that could help other people, and so it was kind of a slow burn, but I then over time got very passionate about that path, and one thing led to another, and I started a functional medicine practice. After a few years of doing that, realized that there just weren't enough of us. There was such a high demand, and there just weren't enough providers to satisfy that demand. So I started a practitioner training program for in functional medicine, 12-month program. I did that for a few years, and then realized that although functional medicine is a key part of the puzzle, diet, lifestyle, and behavior change is extremely important. And for a lot of people, they may not even necessarily need functional medicine. They just need that, to shift their diet, lifestyle, and behavior. And there'll never be enough doctors or medical providers to do that with people. And arguably, they're not the best providers to do that anyways, because it's better to reserve them for doctory type of stuff, like ordering labs and interpreting them and prescribing treatment, et cetera. And they're not really trained in behavior change. So that's when I got really interested in health coaching as a profession, and as a way of addressing the healthcare epidemic that we are facing right now. And so we launched a health coach training program in 2018. Now we just enrolled our 6th cohort for that. So that's been my kind of general trajectory over the past 15, 20 years.
It's funny because you and I were at UC Berkeley at the same time.
Yeah.
We didn't know each other, but I also traveled to South America and Polynesia, and I ended up with parasites, and I ended up going through a health journey, and then I went to grad school at Cornell, and I got Lyme disease and Babesia, and so I also was thrown onto this path. I was already interested in ethnobotany, which is why I started those journeys, but medicine was part of what I was interested in. But I then thought, oh, I should write a book on gluten and Lyme and all this stuff a decade ago, more than 2 decades ago, but I didn't do it, and you did. And the thing that I find remarkable about you is not only do you get it done, but you research so thoroughly and so well. And I hold a pretty high bar for the people that I'm willing to listen to in terms of how they're going to summarize the medical information out there and how they're going to translate research. And you continuously impress me with your perceptive and critical thinking that you apply to some pretty rigorous scientific studies, and that you really have a big picture view of things that very few people take the time and energy to formulate, because it takes so much research and so many studies that you must be reading to come up with your ideas. So what do you think gives you that special gift that many of us really admire?
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate those kind words. Um, I don't know. My parents always used to say I was like a dog with a bone growing up. and they even had a nickname for me, the Hound of Baskerville, I guess, which is wasn't meant to be flattering. So I think that that trait can cut both ways. You know, when I get interested in something, I can be a little bit obsessed, and you know my wife Elan, and if she can confirm this. So I'm, for better and for worse, the type of person that just enjoys doing really deep dives into things that I get interested in. And I've always been that way for as long as I can remember. So I don't know that I can take any credit for it. And I have, again, for whatever reason, an ability to process and synthesize information quickly. Um, I can read, I generally am reading 3-4 books a week, and also lots and lots of studies. And I think that's a capacity that I've intentionally cultivated over time, but that also maybe came, fairly naturally to me as well. And then I think the other thing is that I've always had a lot of different interests, and I've always given myself permission to pursue those, even if I didn't know how they were going to relate to one another. And I think that that's helpful in allowing me to make connections that might be otherwise difficult to make. And I think our educational system doesn't emphasize that enough. It's gotten really narrow and specialized. And, if someone goes into a really specialized field of study, that tends to be all that they are exposed to in school. And I had the benefit of what I would call like a true liberal arts education. And I think that has really supported me in being able to make those connections and do that kind of synthesis. But it just mostly comes from my own interest, and having had some really great mentors and people who encouraged me to follow them.
So one of the things that I also share with you and have since my days at Berkeley is an interest in evolutionary health and ancestral health. And I used to always just say, how would your ancestors be living? How would they be eating? And then you became actively involved with ancestral health. And I was wondering if you could talk to our listeners and viewers about that.
To me, it's just a no-brainer. And I'm always surprised when people push back against the concept, because it's almost kind of as self-evident to me as like, hey, the sky is blue. And, we breathe oxygen and we need it to survive. And if you look at evolutionary biology, there's really no controversy that all organisms are adapted to survive and thrive in a particular environment. And if you change the environment quickly, then that particular organism is going to struggle to adapt fast enough to thrive in that new environment. So, a simple example would be like a type of bacteria that lives deep in the ocean near hydrothermal vents and has adapted survival mechanisms to be able to live in that environment. And then if you take that bacteria and put it in a shallow tide pool, things are not going to go well. That's a fundamental concept in biology, and it's not controversial at all. And yet when we apply that same thinking to human beings, it's all of a sudden somehow becomes controversial. I mean, the reality is that human beings evolve for the vast majority of our evolutionary history in a particular environment. We lived outdoors, we were exposed to sunlight, we ate primarily meat, fish, nuts and seeds, wild fruits and vegetables, and some starchy tubers. We were active most of the day, for a lot of the day, because we had to be in order to gather food or hunt food or build shelter or fight or whatever it was. We lived in sync with the natural rhythms of light and dark. When it got dark, we didn't flip on the lights and, and pull out our iPads. We were, maybe around a fire for a little bit, and we went to bed shortly thereafter, and we woke up when it got light, and we lived in tribal, tight-knit groups with maybe, no more than 100 to 150 people. And that was essentially the story of humanity for and our hominid ancestors for 2 to 2.5 million years. And if you consider human history or hominid history as a football field, you could start walking in one end of that football field and go all the way, even in the end zone, you go all the way to the last half yard on the other end of the football field. And that entire time would be humans and hominids living in the Paleolithic kind of circumstances. And it's only in the last half yard that we developed agriculture. And it's only in the last few inches that the Industrial Revolution occurred. And it's only really in the last few centimeters that our modern life as we know it now, with all the processed and refined food and smartphones and social media and all the pesticides and herbicides and toxins in the environment, everything that we're exposed to now, which we consider to be normal, is just a tiny, tiny blip in human evolutionary history. And so I think it makes sense to start with the hypothesis that there is a mismatch between what our biology and our genes evolved for and then the modern environment that we're living in now. And it may not be as extreme as the example I used of the geothermal bacteria that gets moved to the tide pool, but it's that to some degree, and our health has really suffered from that, both our physical health and also our mental, emotional, psychological health as well.
How would you describe the broader definition of health?
Well, I think over time that's changed for me. Earlier on, just in my own personal journey of recovering my health, my fundamental burning desire was to be symptom free. It was to get back to a previous experience of health or idea of health that I was still holding on to, which was, being free of disease and free of symptoms and free of pain. That was my concept of health. Over time, both in terms of my own experience and then also having now worked with thousands of patients and having trained hundreds of doctors who in turn have worked with hundreds and thousands of patients, the way I think about health has evolved. It's not that I don't think that aiming for being symptom free or pain free or disease free is a worthy goal. And it's not that I don't think that those could be considered aspects of health. But I think that health is more than just the absence of disease or symptoms and pain. And we really have to think about it in a broader context of maybe what we might call human flourishing. The Greeks use this term eudaimonia, which can be roughly translated into human flourishing, or living a good life is a simpler way of putting it. And it could be possible to flourish and live a good life even when you still have pain and symptoms, and even if you have an incurable disease. On the flip side, it's possible to be profoundly unhealthy in many ways, even if you have no physical symptoms or no sign of disease. And we probably all know some people who are at both ends of that spectrum, right? People who have a chronic illness, maybe even a very serious chronic illness, and are constantly struggling with pain and symptoms, and yet might be some of the most joyful, loving, kind, productive people that we know, who just really kind of embody the notion of health. And then on the other hand, you might have someone who is functioning at a very high level physically, but they're kind of a wreck in every other part of their life. And you would not, the word health does not come to mind when you think of them, even though they're physically in really great shape. So I've become more and more interested in this broader definition of health and what health is, and how we define it and how we can work toward it, no matter what the circumstances of our lives are.
I know that you have talked about zooming in and zooming out, and I'm wondering, for someone who's suffering from a chronic illness, how you use zooming in and zooming out in your life.
Yeah, I think it's a critical concept for anybody who's experiencing not just chronic illness, but chronic pain, chronic stress. For example, I think of someone like a caregiver for an Alzheimer's patient. We know that's one of the most stressful experiences that you can have. Really, any long-term challenge that you're facing. So this concept of zooming in and zooming out refers to the ebb and flow that I think needs to happen in terms of our efforts to deal directly with those symptoms, whether they're pain or illness. So, as a personal example, I was dealing with pretty intense symptoms for probably a decade. And there were periods of time during that decade where I was intensely focused on trying to resolve the symptoms directly. So, for example, I was doing a new dietary approach, or I was taking a new supplement regimen, or taking medication, or I was trying some new treatment that I was working on with a doctor, or I was spending a lot of time researching something that I hoped might give me relief, or pursuing a new avenue of investigation. And that's zooming in, so that's really narrowly focusing my attention on things that I imagine will have a direct impact on the pain and the symptoms, um, in the way that we typically understand that. Meaning, so like, I take this supplement, it has this immediate effect, it works based on this mechanism, right? But what I found is that if I stayed zoomed in like that for too long, I would become exhausted and depressed and even helpless and hopeless, especially if I wasn't making the progress that I wanted to make, because the quality of that experience is is not really that great and it's not sustainable. It can amount to a lot of time on the internet, researching stuff. It can amount to like a kind of white knuckling and holding on tight and regimented type of life where you're following a very strict diet and you're taking different pills, 6 times a day, and you're working really hard at this health project idea. And I think for me, the way I discovered this and learned was not through any kind of graceful, premeditated process. It was just through collapse. It was like I had reached there were a few points in time where I just collapsed, and I was like, I couldn't do it anymore. And I'm pretty tenacious by my nature. As I mentioned, I tend to get pretty obsessed. So it took a lot to get me to that point. I'm a slow learner in that respect. Other people might have reached this conclusion sooner, but it took a lot to bring me to my knees. But when that did happen, I realized, okay, so there's a role here for zooming out. And one of my first experiences of that, I still remember very clearly. I made an intentional choice to not think too much about diet. It didn't mean I was going to eat donuts and pizza, and that I've just never eaten that way, or not for not any significant length of time. So I was still eating probably what most people would say was relatively healthy diet, but I also didn't limit or restrict myself. If I was out with friends and they were having pizza, I had pizza. Or if I went and would have like a favorite meal that reminded me of childhood favorite food occasionally. And I explicitly said, I'm not going to pursue any new treatments. I'm not going to get on the internet and start researching stuff. I'm just going to focus on things that bring me pleasure, things that make me happy, on rest, on relationships, connecting with other people, feeling like I'm not alone. I'm not completely isolated in this experience. And interestingly enough, not only did I enjoy that experience, I mean, that's the predictable outcome, right? That was much more pleasurable of an experience, but my symptoms got better. And this was like a light bulb moment for me, because in my mind, I was holding it as like, either I do this intense focus of trying to eliminate my symptoms and, use supplements and diet and all the things that we typically talk about, or I focus on just having a good time and enjoying my life, and my symptoms, nothing's going to happen with my symptoms. But it was actually not that's not what happened at all. And so by doing those other things and channeling energies into those different parts of my life that have been neglected for so long, I actually started feeling better in all of the different ways. And now I have a framework for understanding that. I understand, for example, that pleasure releases endorphins, and endorphins actually play a really important role in the immune system. I didn't know that before. Endorphins are important for stress management and stress relief. They have an impact on the nervous system. You know, rest, of course, can play an important role in tissue regeneration and repair and all of this stuff. So I understand now a lot more the mechanisms of why that would strategy would be effective. But at the time, it was not a choice that I made strategically. It was a kind of choice that came out of just not being able to do anything else. But now at this point, I think about it in those terms of zooming in and zooming out. And I think, with my patients that I work with that have complex chronic illness is something we often discuss, because so many patients who come to me are in that zoomed in place, and I totally get that. I've been there myself, so there's no judgment, but it's really important not to live there all of the time, because life, frankly, in many cases can just become not very worth living. And I've seen that in people who are with Lyme and other tick-borne illnesses and mold-related illnesses, and these really intense, mysterious, and difficult to treat conditions. That I think it's even more important in those cases to zoom out periodically.
And to be clear, it's zooming in and zooming out at the same time. You're still staying on your supplements and you're doing all that work, but you're also making sure that you can see outside of that and look out the window and see what's going on.
Yeah, and it's not the same for everybody. Some people actually may get more benefit from zooming in. Other people may find that zooming out is something that leads to more transformation and change than zooming in. It doesn't mean there's never a time to zoom in for those people, but if we think of a ratio, use the photography analogy. Some people really like that wide angle view, and some people really like that telephoto zoomed in view, and it might change over time too. That's part of, I think, the importance of listening and getting to know ourselves. Like for me, I got to the point where it was clear when I needed to zoom out and clear when I needed to zoom in. And it wasn't on a perfect schedule. It wasn't like, okay, 3 months, time to zoom out, 3 months more, time to zoom in. We have to listen for those signs and signals, and having a guide or someone that we trust in our life that can help with that is helpful. My wife, was that person for me among other people, but it can change throughout the course of one's life. For example, right now, I've been pretty zoomed out for quite a while. And I'm not in the same place that I was back then either. And I don't have the level of symptoms anywhere near what I had at that point, but I'm not symptom free. And it's not that I don't deal with symptoms anymore. It's just that I tend to deal with them in a more zoomed out way at this point, which often surprises people given my profession and given what I do. But that's actually what works best for me now.
So what kind of diet are you on? I think everyone wants to know what Coach Kresser is eating these days.
Yeah, I'm not on a diet. Like that's part of being zoomed out. Is I really, and I don't mean that to be flippant. Like I really don't conceive of myself as being on any kind of diet. And that's one thing I learned about myself over time, is that I don't do well when I place kind of strict limits around what I can and can't eat. And again, my parents will attest to my relationship with limits and boundaries. I push back against them. And so, essentially, I give myself full permission to eat whatever I want. It just so happens that I 90% of the time want to eat just healthy food because that's what makes me feel good. So, it's fairly close to a paleo-ish type of diet, but I eat white rice, I eat dairy products, not fluid milk, but like, fermented dairy and full fat dairy, like cream and butter. I'll eat grains here and there, gluten-free. I don't eat really gluten. My wife is severely gluten intolerant. My daughter is as well. I'm not, but just given that given that environment, it works for me not to eat gluten. And lots of fruits and vegetables. But I have my things that like really I get a lot of pleasure from eating and that I'll eat periodically because they make me happy. So chips and salsa is a great example. I spent a lot of time in Mexico over the years, and it's a visceral felt sense experience to have, to eat chips and salsa and have, like with Mexican food, it brings me joy. And on Saturday nights we have a family movie night, and we'll typically like watch a movie together and have some ice cream, and that's fun. We cook homemade pizza on a grain-free crust, this Italia crust from Whole Foods, and we have fun like making different kinds of pizza. And so we have this really fun like pizza ice cream movie night on Saturdays. And I think those kinds of rituals are really important. Again, it's just about like including pleasure and even things that we associate with good feelings and good times from childhood with food is an important part of the experience. And I think that's also important for kids as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And it will shift and vary too. If I'm on a backpacking trip, I'm probably going to be a little more flexible in what I eat just because of the circumstances. Or if I'm traveling or with friends, I'm not going to be the person who brings their brown bag lunch into the restaurant because I refuse to eat industrial seed oils that the foods are cooked in. Not knocking that, again, just doesn't, that level of rigor and limit doesn't work for me. It doesn't make me happy, so I don't do that.
Which is so funny because I was just on your website and I saw your big article on seed oils. So
Yeah.
everyone who reads that is going to be the person who goes into the restaurant with their brown bag. But
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, everything in moderation, including moderation, goes the Buddha saying, right? So it's like, I do feel like I need to atone a little bit because some people will read that article and come to that conclusion. That's not the intention. The intention is, hey, we probably shouldn't be eating processed and refined chips, crackers, whatever, with seed oils all day long, every day, which is what a lot of people do. And we probably shouldn't be eating at restaurants, every day, which is what a lot of people do because these oils are not good. But we are also resilient. And we have, in most cases, the ability to handle some level of non-optimal input, whether that's food, whether that's technology, too much screen time, whether that's toxins that we encounter in the environment, whether that's difficult relationships or emotions. Like we shouldn't be so fragile that we can't tolerate anything that's not optimal. And this reminds me of a story that one of my professors in school used to tell. One of the students came up to him and said, and was kind of boasting about how he had become so pure that he couldn't even eat in a restaurant anymore because when he did, he would just feel terrible. And my professor's perspective on that was, that's terrible. That's nothing to boast about. That's actually a sign that your health is declining because you're not resilient enough to encounter something that's not optimal and to be able to just handle that and with ease. And that's a movement in the wrong direction. And actually, I see this happen to people who go on really restricted diets for a long period of time. And it's a reason that I don't tend to recommend those diets in my practice, except for short periods of time when necessary, is because I rarely find that more and more restriction eventually leads to less restriction. I find that more restriction tends to lead to even more restriction over time. And I think part of it is that the body is not being stimulated to develop that resilience. And so I often will encourage people to start adding foods back into their diet that they've taken away, assuming they're healthful foods, when they're able to do that. Now, again, we recognize that if someone who is following AIP, autoimmune protocol, and they need to do that to get their symptoms under control, of course. But at some point, I would suggest they start adding some of those foods they remove back in, because A, it can be easy to develop nutrient deficiencies on a really restricted diet. And B, I do think the body kind of loses some resilience when it doesn't have those different inputs. So yeah, I mean that's something that I came to over many years. I found it to be largely true.
I've seen that with gluten. People go off, and then if they eat it again, they feel way worse than they ever did the first time. But that feels different. I feel like people who are really gluten sensitive probably just need to stay off of it for life. And
Yeah, that might be a little different because of the mechanism there. But there's studies in the literature that suggest that people who are dairy intolerant, and this is mostly lactose, not so much casein intolerance, the protein, they can essentially train themselves to be lactose tolerant by consuming fermented dairy, starting in very small amounts and then gradually increasing over time. Because what happens is the microorganisms in the fermented dairy probably engage in some horizontal gene transfer with the microorganisms in the gut, which then provides the enzymes that are needed to break down lactose in the gut. At least that's the theory. So that's interesting to me. And I think that may apply to other foods as well. We know people in Japan, for example, have a particular enzyme to break down the complex polysaccharides in seaweed. And that if people eat seaweed enough, that they can develop that capacity over time as well. So, I think in general, what I would say is I'm a fan of things that build resilience and that improve our ability to tolerate the inevitable challenges that we're going to face in life. And that doesn't mean like donuts and soda, because those things don't confer any benefit to us other than maybe if people really like to eat them, once in a blue moon. But foods that are beneficial, I think we should try to add them back in if we can, without too much distress or any exacerbation of symptoms.
well, I thought when you were talking about the dairy, I thought you were going to talk about how people go gluten-free for a long time and then their intestinal villi build back up, and then they have the little crypts where they produce the lactase enzymes, and then all of a sudden they're able to eat dairy for the first time in their lives.
Yeah.
They've healed their gut from being off of gluten. So it's complex, right?
Yeah, that's true too.
And would you say maybe the 80-20 rule is what you sort of would?
Yeah, I mean, it might be sometimes more like 90-10 or even 95-5. Other times it might even be 70-30 if I'm on vacation. So it just varies with what's going on in my life. Rather than getting fixated on a particular ratio, I think the concept is still sound, where, most of the time we're eating the foods that we know are healthy and beneficial to us and nutritious and support our body and our mind. And then there's some other period of time, whatever that number ends up being, where we're eating foods that bring us pleasure and joy and help us connect with others socially. And if I'm traveling, for example, and somebody invites me to their house and they serve me something that I wouldn't otherwise eat, I will almost always choose to eat that thing because I want to show gratitude and appreciation to the host. And I feel like the connect, the experience that comes out of that is more important than me sticking to a very rigid diet. Of course, if I was had celiac and they served gluten, I wouldn't do that because the calculation is different in that situation. So you always have to evaluate based on your own circumstances.
Okay, well, I got you talking about nutrition for a long time. It wasn't part of my
It's a
plan.
popular topic.
I can't help it because you're Chris Kresser. So you co-founded the California Center for Functional Medicine with Dr. Sanjay Schweig. And I know that you don't really treat a lot of Lyme patients, but I know that he does. Do you have any theories on evolutionary health and any potential symbiotic evolution with Lyme Borrelia spirochetes?
That's a fascinating topic. And I, many years ago, encountered the work of Moses Velasquez Manoff, who wrote about the hygiene hypothesis and then the old friends hypothesis, which is very similar, which is the idea that human beings co-evolved with a number of different organisms, which we now typically see as pathogenic. So, um, you know, nematodes like whipworm or hookworm are a good example of that. Helicobacter pylori, which is the bacterium that causes ulcers, is another example of that. And it's very possible that Borrelia may be included in that group of organisms. And one of the examples, similar examples, is we've been eating gluten for a long time as humans, right? And certainly there were people who were gluten intolerant in the past, and we just didn't understand celiac or gluten intolerance, and they were very sick, and some kids even died from malnutrition. But I don't think anybody is out there arguing that the level of gluten intolerance has always been the same, now versus the past, or that it's somehow increased because we're eating a lot more wheat and gluten. We're not. So how do you explain the fact that gluten intolerance is so much more prevalent now than it was before? It's not just because of testing and detection. There must be something else going on. And that something else, in my opinion, is a change in our internal ecosystem that took something that made us very susceptible to an antigen that we have been exposed to for a very long time and typically only cause problems for maybe a very small minority of people, but now is a widespread problem because of changes to our gut flora, changes in nutrient status, maybe exposure to other environmental toxins that dysregulates our immune system. We could go on and on with the list of threats in the modern environment. And so I don't know that this is what's happening with Lyme and Borrelia and other tick-borne pathogens, but I suspect that that there's something here. I don't know to what extent, but I suspect that there is definitely something that has shifted in our own physiology that's making us more susceptible to these pathogens.
So just lastly, do you have any advice for people with Lyme disease and chronic illness who might be listening to this podcast? Things that they can do that you haven't already discussed so far in this podcast?
Yeah, I mean, Lyme is just so challenging. I don't need to tell you that. I mean, you're so deeply immersed in that world, and Sunja as well. And I've treated a number of people with Lyme. I probably had Lyme myself. Even the fact that I have to say probably is indicative of the challenge that we faced with Lyme and tick-borne disease, right? It's like in so many cases, it's like horseshoes and hand grenades. You're like trying to get close. You're not sure if you're going to be right on the money, but sometimes close enough is close enough. And my feeling over many years, just but with my own experience and treating a number of patients, and I think you would agree, and I'm pretty sure Sanjay agrees as well, is that the ecosystem is very important. There's often, in the case of infectious disease, a myopic focus on the pathogen. This again is I think a consequence of our conventional approach to treating disease. There's, way back in the 19th century, there was Koch's postulates, and that was a major advance in medicine, which, he was responsible essentially for recognizing that bacteria were the cause of infectious disease. What I think came out of that, a really important realization, is a hyper focus, too much focus on the pathogen itself and not enough focus on the environment that pathogen is in. And if there was one insight that I could offer from my time, recognizing that I'm not nearly as experienced with tick-borne diseases as many other practitioners are, that the ecosystem deserves attention. And by that, I mean everything other than the pathogen. So the gut microbiome, our diet, our lifestyle, how much rest are we getting? How are we managing our stress? How are the relationships in our life? Are we doing things that bring us joy and pleasure? Even if they're small things, if we're really sick, like going to sit outside and read a book and feeling the sun on your skin or the wind, on your skin. And, are we taking the time to play with our kids? And are we working on something in our lives that where we can experience a sense of mastery or fulfillment, which I think is really important when you're sick. Those things we tend to forget about when we're really sick and dealing with a chronic health struggle. We either don't feel like we can do them because of our energy levels, or we're spending a lot of our time seeing doctors or researching cures. And again, that's necessary in many cases to some extent, and it's important, but not to the total exclusion of everything else, in my experience. And so even small steps in each of those areas can make a big difference, in my experience, and can provide sustenance, both physically, emotionally, even spiritually, that helps us to endure the challenge of living with chronic pain or illness.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that'll resonate with a lot of people. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me on the Ticktective video and podcast series, Chris Kresser.
Thanks, Leah. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Ticktective podcast and video series, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation. You can find out more or donate at bayarealyme.org.